there is a place beneath the center of Rome that no one may access without permission. A place where history is not displayed but rather hidden behind 3 levels of iron doors between walls that do not echo. For over 12 centuries, the Vatican has stored millions of pages of papers, refusing to publish them, and instead waiting. Handwritten letters from popes that were never delivered. Bans on books that changed the world. Records of Marian apparitions were discreetly ignored. The Vatican exchanged secret messages with monarchs and fascists and Western intelligence, and created works of art never seen before. Why does the Vatican preserve all of this but never speak about it? This is not a conspiracy-related tale. This is the narrative of the most profoundly buried memories in the realm of faith. Welcome to Secrets of the Vatican Archives, where we don't rehash what has previously been said but instead gently reveal what was meant to be hidden. I was formerly one of the few people permitted access to the Vatican's guarded archives. Don't get me wrong, I wasn't a cardinal, a well-known historian, or descended from any noble family. I was just a caretaker, a custodian, as the Italians say. My duty included cleaning, taking notes, and delivering approved documents to the scholars. But on certain nights, when the old priest had fallen asleep and the oil light burned silently in the corner, I would quietly open doors that no one else ventured to approach. From that point forward, there was no turning back. I know I don't have much time left. My hands start to shake when they touch the parchment that used to feel as familiar as my own skin. My eyes become blurry in the candlelight, and my heart slows down in these last years. However, I must talk before everything disappears with me, not to shock, accuse, or absolve, but so that someone else can comprehend. Neither the light nor the dark has ever truly owned truth. Between waiting to be heard is where it resides. I have seen Pope Pius XII's unanswered letters lying silently in an inconspicuous drawer. I've read forbidden copies of books that were once considered dangerous to the faith. I've stood in front of artworks by Caravaggio that were never displayed, because the eyes in those portraits stared directly into a kind of suffering that theology dared not confront. Most importantly, I've realized that what we can't reveal isn't false, but rather too accurate to be accepted. I am not asking you to believe me. I am unable to provide proof that the rest of the world would recognize. But if you are still listening, if you are still reading, and if somewhere inside you still believe that beneath every haloed glory there lies something deeper, something unresolved, then perhaps you are the one I must say this to, because one day those doors will not remain closed forever. I once thought of the Vatican as merely a place of prayer, where popes in white robes stood outside in St. Peter's Square, and a religious symbol. But that was just the surface. The old stone walls, soaring domes, and triple-locked doors conceal a world that most people will never see. The Vatican Secret Archives. People often refer to it as the Vatican Secret Archives, but its official Latin name is Archivum Secretum Apostolicum Vaticanum, which translates to the Pope's private archive. The word secretum in Latin does not signify secret in the current sense. It means private. This archive belongs to the Pope personally. It is not affiliated with the Catholic Church as a whole. The location's privacy has sparked several ideas, including political investigations and searches for lost tales. The archive spans 85 kilometers of shelving with over 35,000 catalogued entries, covering events from the 8th century to the present. But only a small portion is accessible to scholars. The most delicate, classified, or unreleased materials are kept safe deep within the inner vaults. And it is here that some of the most pivotal and contentious moments in European and Christian history are preserved. A copy of Galileo Galilei's letter to the Church in 1613, in which he attempted to prove that his theories on astronomy did not conflict with the Bible, is one of the preserved artifacts. But the Church outlawed the teaching of heliocentrism in 1616 after declaring it to be heretical. The Inquisition, a court whose actions are likewise documented in great detail in these archives, tried Galileo in 1633. The 14th century trial of the Knights Templar is one of the most searched collections. All records of the trial were thought to have been destroyed by the Vatican for hundreds of years. But in 2001, an Italian scholar named Barbara Friel uncovered a copy of the Pergamentium Chanal, a document proving that Pope Clement IX had secretly absolved the Templars. The long-held notion that the Church had consented to their destruction was clearly refuted by this discovery. It posed a frightening question. Why was the truth kept for almost 700 years? Documents reveal the Vatican's ties with authoritarian regimes throughout the 20th century, particularly Nazi Germany. The archives contain hundreds of letters exchanged between the Vatican and Hitler's regime, as well as reports sent by German bishops to the Holy See. These sources indicate that the Vatican was aware of the mass slaughter of Jews at an early stage. Their answer was complex, driven by faith, political calculations, and fear of persecution. In 2020, the Vatican opened a portion of the archive of Pope Pius XIII, who led the Church from 1939 to 1958 during World War II, behind the scenes. A tactic that continues to provoke discussion regarding its efficacy and morality. However, religious matters are not the only topics covered in the archives. Additionally, they include sketches by Bernini, handwritten letters by Michelangelo, a farewell note from Mary, Queen of Scots prior to her execution, and even a 19th century letter from a Native American chief to the Pope. The Vatican archives serve as a window to history, spanning from the Crusades to scientific advances, theological schisms, and present political intrigue. Despite the archive's historical significance, access is strictly limited. Each year, only about 60 to 80 scholars are permitted to study on site. They must apply, specify their study topic, and follow tight guidelines. No photographs, photocopies, or documents may be taken outside the room. Most essential, no one is granted unrestricted access. The most sensitive areas remain sealed. I'm not attempting to make inferences. I don't profess to know all the truth, but I feel that standing before the countless shelves with decades-old dust and quivering handwritten sentences from the 10th century makes you realize why the Vatican guards this location so closely. Some truths are too vast to reveal. Some stories, once recounted, will cause us to rethink the fundamental foundations of our culture and faith. The Vatican archives hold sensitive and powerful documents, particularly those related to Christianity's Great Split. The split between Catholicism and Protestantism. Few people are aware that in the early days of the Reformation, confidential conversations between Martin Luther and some Vatican representatives were scrupulously documented. A Dutch scholar was moved to tears when he read handwritten notes in slanted brown ink. The documents revealed that both sides attempted to prevent the split, but were ultimately driven apart by pride and power. As early as the 1530s, the Vatican surreptitiously sent envoys to the German states to talk with reforming elements. The records include declarations from Bishop Girolamo Aleandro, a theologian and diplomat who suggested uncommon theological compromises to maintain church unity. However, when Luther's cautious yet resolute reply appeared, the church turned away, and history proceeded irreversibly. These documents are preserved in a sealed dossier and can only be accessed by people with advanced research credentials and a clearly stated objective. Another topic that previously sent shivers down my spine was the Chronicle of the Inquisition. The Vatican still retains thousands of indictments, interrogation transcripts, and death sentences from persons accused of heresy between the 12th and 19th centuries. One of the most notorious cases is that of Giordano Bruno, a philosopher, astrologer, and proponent of the theory of an infinite universe. The documentation on Bruno illustrates not only his logical arguments but also the emotional battle of the clerics who were supposed to evaluate him. In one internal note, a cleric wrote, "If we spare him, dogma will waver; if we burn him, history will never forgive us." Bruno was finally executed in 1600 at Campo de' Fiori. The centuries-long stillness that followed is one of the clearest examples of the ongoing confrontation between religion and science. The archives also house a large collection of records about the Vatican's interactions with secular powers, particularly Napoleon Bonaparte. When Napoleon seized Italy, he ordered that the most valuable Vatican documents be brought to Paris. Dozens of thousands of items were boxed, sealed, and transported through the Alps. Many never returned. What the Vatican was able to reclaim after Napoleon's defeat is still highly classified. I once saw a handwritten note from Pope Pius II describing how he felt like the Church was losing its soul as ancient texts were loaded onto French wagons. The text was written in charcoal ink in a small, careful script, with a single line at the bottom of each page. "We've been stripped bare." One of the most surprising revelations stems from diplomatic correspondence between the Vatican and Asian countries. Few people are aware that in the 17th century, the Vatican covertly exchanged communications with Japan's Tokugawa shogunate, despite the fact that Christianity was outlawed there. To prevent detection, the letters were sent by Portuguese missionaries concealed in commercial ships and miniature wooden statues. Tokugawa Ieyasu ordered a letter in 1611 that stated, "We do not accept a faith that divides families, but we respect the knowledge and loyalty your missionaries bring." The Vatican kept the letter as a reminder of their unsuccessful diplomatic contact with the closed Asian Empire. Maps and blueprints of abandoned churches, monasteries, fortresses, and catacombs are also included in this little-known area of the archive. Maps of ancient dioceses that disappeared because of war, plague, or political unrest are among them. The layout of Montsûr Abbey, which was the scene of a siege and widespread burning in 1244 during the crusade against the Cathars, is one that still troubled me. On that map, there is an unusual marking, an escape route that is not documented in any official records. The fate of the remaining Cathars is unknown, and the document has not been authenticated or disputed. This secret, like others in the archive, highlights the complexity of history. One area in the archives, carefully secured, contains data on the Vatican's political relationships with world powers from the 19th century until today. Each country's boxes are arranged neatly. Each one is a piece of truth and memory that has not been covered by the official historical narratives. The Vatican gained its independence in 1929. As a result of the Lateran Treaty between Pope Pius XI and Mussolini, as most People are aware. However, few people really comprehend that prior to Danko. In 1870, when the Italian kingdom annexed the Papal States, for nearly 60 years, the Vatican was largely isolated. It was a nation without borders located in the heart of Rome. During that time, the popes refused to recognize the Italian government and never left the Vatican gates. During this tense period, the Church established a secret communication network with other nations, including France, Austria, Spain, and the US. One document from 1922 shows that the Vatican once conveyed a private communication to US President Warren G. Harding offers to serve as a liaison between America and Europe's divided Catholic states in the aftermath of World War I. Because the Vatican lacked legal status as a state at the time, this episode was never documented in official history books. The memorandum, however, still exists, complete with a signature and seal. The paper was fragile and had brown corners, but the language remained vibrant, like if history was whispering in my ear. The World War II era saw an avalanche of sensitive material. Numerous reports from local bishops to the Vatican confirm the mass murder of Jews in Poland, Germany, and France. Cardinal Adam Sapaha wrote a 1942 report that was sent from Kaf. Later, Pope John Paul II's spiritual advisor. We will be guilty of complicity before God if we remain silent, he wrote. However, even such a pressing quiet was appreciated. What caused the Vatican to postpone denouncing genocide? Whether it was a tactic to safeguard the Church and its adherents in conquered territory has long been a topic of discussion among academics. However, a document I once read, handwritten by a member of the Papal Council, revealed a greater complexity. It warned of the dangers of losing control of the faithful if belief is drawn into the maelstrom of political ideology. In other words, the Vatican feared that taking sides would split the global Church. That hush persisted until the 1960s, when the Vatican launched one of the most fundamental changes in modern Church history: the Second Vatican Council. The files from that council make up one of the archive's largest and most intricate sections. Theological discussions, political reactions, transcripts of bishop speeches, and evaluations of the Church's evolving power in a world that is changing quickly are all documented in thousands of pages. I once read the record of a discussion between two senior cardinals on whether or not local languages should be permitted during Mass instead of Latin. If we abandon Latin, we abandon the symbol of eternity, one person remarked. If we don't change, we abandon the people, was the other's response. The council was not only concerned with language. It was the Vatican's first genuine invitation to dialogue with Jews, Buddhists, Muslims, and even atheists. The collection still contains an unreleased draft of a speech in which Pope Paul VI intended to make a formal apology for the Vatican's silence during the Holocaust. Finally, the speech was replaced by a more neutral version. No one knows why. Only a handwritten comment in the margin is still in Latin. Tempest is not a domestic animal. The time has not yet arrived. The council was not just about language. It was the first time the Vatican had actually opened up to discussion with Muslims, Buddhists, Jews, and even atheists. An unpublished draft of a speech that Pope Paul VI intended to use to formally apologize for the Vatican's silence during the Holocaust is still in the archive. The speech was eventually changed to a more impartial version. The precise reason is unknown. The only remnant of the Latin is a handwritten comment in the margin. Temperamental. Non-domist. The moment is still not here. I never came across the kind of worldwide conspiracy that wild ideas frequently imply as I read through these records. What I witnessed was a conflict between morality and survival, between politics and faith. The records of the Vatican are truthful. They wait for someone who is brave and patient enough to read, comprehend, and acknowledge that history has always been gray rather than black or white. I've always been troubled by one particular part of the archives. Documents pertaining to the Vatican's interactions with colonial powers, particularly from the 15th to the 19th centuries. As I turned the pages of these records, I never saw the kind of global conspiracy that wild theories often suggest. What I saw was a struggle between faith and politics, between morality and survival. The Vatican archives do not lie. They wait for someone patient and brave enough to read, to understand, and to accept that history has never been black or white, but always gray. There is one section of the archives that has always weighed heavily on me. The records concerning the relationship between the Vatican and colonial empires, especially during the 15th to 19th centuries. The worn pages inside those boxes include no direct allegations, explicit declarations of support for war, or deprivation of liberty. Yet, within the finely composed sentences, there is a quiet truth. Faith once moved alongside the sword of European colonialism as it spread around the world. Pope Alexander V issued the papal bull Inter Terra in 1493, exactly 1 year after Christopher Columbus' arrival in the New World. He issued a proclamation dividing the non-Christian world into two influence zones. One for Portugal, one for Spain, as though the Church had the power to divide up the world. The Vatican archives still contain that paper, which is kept in a thick folder called Decrees Concerning the New World. It bears the crimson seal of the Holy See, and is inscribed in formal Latin. I felt cold when I held it in my hands, since this was the height of the politicization of faith. Letters from the Vatican to the rulers of Portugal, Spain, and eventually France and Belgium are attached to that decree. The Pope asked for assurances in them on the protection of missionaries in recently conquered areas and the propagation of the faith. However, the actual situation on the ground frequently involved appeals for assistance from protesting clerics, cultural erasure, and bloodshed. Their voices have been retained in little quantities, yet they are still audible like glimmering lights in a pitch-black world. Father Barthold de Lascasa's letter to Pope Paul III in 1537 was one example of such a voice. The letter describes mass executions of indigenous people in the Caribbean, churches built with blood, soap, and soil, and religious authorities silence in the face of atrocities. Reading that letter felt like suffocation. It didn't feel like a prayer. It felt like a plea for help, not only for the victims but also for the Church's conscience. The archives also include a draft of Pope Paul III's apostolic brief Sublimis Deus, released in 1537. The author argued that indigenous peoples in the Americas have souls and the right to receive the gospel, and should not be enslaved. For its day, it was a progressive manifesto. Tragically, however, its use was swiftly discontinued due to pressure from European kings who were unwilling to give up the financial benefits of slavery. The Vatican's diplomatic involvement in defending religious interests within colonies in Asia and Africa becomes more evident as the 19th century progresses. I once went through a lengthy dossier in the Indana archives that described the existence of French missionaries in Vietnam prior to the French invasion. Letters from the Nguyen dynasty to Rome describe pressures faced by Catholic converts, but also mention opportunities to expand influence and mediate with Western merchants, indicating a difficult integration of faith and secular power. The Vatican did not directly order colonial conquests. However, one can trace the Church's role in legitimizing empires and calming the conscience of those who conquered through the official blessings, the moral legitimacy it extended, and the stamps of approval. The Vatican archives also contain several records that reflect internal dissension. Many priests, monks, and bishops resisted the use of religion for colonial interests. In 1885, a French bishop in the Congo filed an official protest with the Vatican after witnessing hundreds of people having their hands chopped off for not meeting King Leopold II's rubber quotas. The Vatican's response was recorded in a single, short line. "We pray for them, but intervention is out of reach." Perhaps this is why the Vatican archives are more than just a collection of memories. They are also a mirror, reflecting the thin line between faith and politics, righteousness and power. The cracked red wax seals and signatures of popes, cardinals, kings, and merchants remind me that history is never linear. Despite its purity, the Vatican has had a role in shaping human history. The Vatican's role in politics was not limited to the Middle Ages or World War II. The archives preserved significant historical events until the late 20th century. The diplomatic documents of the Holy See's interactions with world powers during the Cold War, especially those with the Soviet Union, Eastern Europe, and Latin America, are kept in one of the safest sections of the Vatican archives. I can still clearly recall my initial access to the extensive dossier on Poland in the 1970s, when the Solidarity movement was starting to gain traction as a representation of anti-communist resistance. Few people are aware that the Vatican secretly provided opposition groups with money, printing supplies, and even intelligence, despite the fact that Pope John Paul II, the first Polish pope, backed this movement. The internal reports provide detailed documentation of these acts. One memorandum sent from the Vatican Secretariat of State to the Apostolic Nuncio in Warsaw includes a handwritten note from Cardinal Cazzarelli. This is more than just a defense of faith. This is a critical moment for survival. These documents show that the Vatican was not a passive observer, but rather a sophisticated political actor, wielding soft power to influence major shifts in the global order. Poland was not the sole focus. The Vatican also made significant interventions in Latin America. In one secret file, I uncovered unsettling stories about Argentina. During the Dirty War, which lasted from 1976 to 1983, local bishops' requests, lists of kidnapped priests, and the Vatican's conflicting reactions. A cable from Buenos Aires mentioned the assassination of Father Carlos Muga, who advocated for the underprivileged and opposed military repression. The Vatican replied, "We cannot publicly take sides in an internal conflict." The remark stuck with me because it reflected the Vatican's customary tactic of remaining openly neutral, while discreetly supporting the just side. The archives of Chile during Augusto Pinochet's reign document both quiet times and instances of covert coercion. Cardinal Angelo Sedano expressed concern that the Church is being seen as a haven for regime opponents in a fully documented private meeting with Chilean military leaders. At the same time, records show that the Vatican protected priests who were sheltering political fugitives, not through public decree, but through internal memos requesting the reinstatement of dismissed bishops who supported the opposition. The Vatican's relationship with the Soviet Union became more difficult as the Cold War progressed. Even though Catholicism was fiercely repressed in Soviet regions, the Vatican maintained Discrete contact lines. A typed report dated March 12, 1962 describes a confidential meeting. An unauthorized Vatican ambassador and a Khrushchev government representative met in Vienna. There was nothing explosive about the conversation. They talked about clerical safety and religious freedom. However, the meeting's very existence conveyed a strong message. If it might save lives and maintain religion, the Vatican was open to dialogue. It is crucial to remember that, at least not in the manner that the outside world frequently hopes, the Vatican did not always support justice. Regarding Spain during Franco, the Vatican upheld decades of diplomatic ties with the dictatorship. According to some academics, this is a compromise with authoritarianism in order to safeguard the faithful. Despite their disagreements, bishops eventually obeyed higher authority, according to letters that have been saved in the archives. I had long believed that the Vatican archives would contain missing relics, ancient texts, or mysterious mysteries. But after years of research, I've come to grasp this. Truths, not things from the past, are the most startling discoveries. That are all too political, too real, and too similar to the things that still happen to us today. Many people would rather avoid confronting certain truths. The Vatican isn't a supernatural entity. It is a political religious entity that functions through logic, strategy, and careful calculation. And its archives, rather than the stained glass windows or sacred sculptures, are the most honest reflection of this multifaceted reality. None of the chambers I've ever entered inside the Vatican archives have left me as silent as the one marked P12 Pest. Thought that moniker was associated with the Pope, who governed from 1939 until 1958, a period that coincided almost fully with World War II. One of the most persistent arguments in contemporary history is still centered on World War II. In the face of the most heinous genocide of the 20th century, did the Vatican say enough, do enough, or keep quiet long enough? Historians from all across the world were divided for decades by the sealing of religious records. He has been referred to as the Pope of Silence. Some argue that he is a careful diplomat, compelled to remain silent in order to protect lives that might never have been saved by public speech. Then, in 2020, when the Vatican formally declassified some of his papacy's archives, a wave of surprise went over the academic community. I was one of the few people present at the archives when the materials were originally opened. I recall vividly the first time I opened a file titled simply Santori der the Acts of the Holy Father during the battle. Inside, there were letters, reports, and telegrams. Many bishops from Germany, Poland, and Hungary sent messages between 1941 and 1944. On March 16, 1942, the Archbishop of Lviv wrote a letter detailing the expulsion of over 1,000 Jewish citizens from the town without any formal charges or punishment. Ultimately, he begged the Vatican to step in, or at the very least to speak up. Only a few paragraphs made up the Vatican's answer that was added shortly after. Although we are all grieving, prayer is currently our most effective tool. It wasn't a rejection of aid, but it was obvious that the action was insufficient to halt the events that were taking place. A thick folder with the title Rich Este Dieodoilo was marked individually. Appeals for assistance and asylum. There were hundreds of individual pleas for protection written to the Holy See by Jews, priests, academics, and even artists, to avoid being discovered by German forces. Some were given fake documents that identified them as Catholics, or helped hide in convents with the help of nuns. Others, however, did not hear back. I was frozen in place by one page in particular. It was a handwritten list of 44 names. Each name was accompanied by their addresses, religions, ages, and a note written in the Santa Brigida convent. The letter was dated October 10, 1943, only 3 days after German forces began gathering up Jews in Rome. According to cross-referenced records, only 12 of the 44 people listed survived. And then there's a detail that few people are aware of, something that only those who have read the pages can see. Between 1942 and 1944, the Vatican sent several communications to the German embassy in Rome requesting a reduction in persecution in areas where Catholic Jews lived. The public was never shown these letters. They didn't use foul language, the word crime, or the word genocide. Rather, they discussed the need to protect the inalienable right to life and social stability in a diplomatic manner. That might have been the only language that was still usable at the time. However, that prudence has continued to be a cause of grief and controversy for subsequent generations. The archive also includes a whole chapter on Jewish community pleas after the war. In 1945, a delegation representing a European jury wrote to the Holy See, requesting confirmation that Catholic organizations had hidden Jewish children throughout the war and that those youngsters be restored to their surviving relatives. The Vatican stated, "We will only allow it if the youngsters freely opt to leave their current surroundings." However, many of these children were just 5 or 6 years old at the time. Most remembered nothing but the convent walls and the faith in which they had recently been christened. It would be years before that moral wound healed. I found a draft of a speech that was never given, written for Easter 1943, among the thousands of pages. "We cannot close our eyes to the cries of a people cast out," was one of its lines. They are still human even though they do not have the name of Christ. The public never heard that line. The final version of the speech was altered and that passage was eliminated. There was no explanation. There was just a red stamp left. There are no reservations. People frequently regard the Vatican as a Western institution linked to Europe, and the history of Christian do not publish. What I saw does not entitle me to draw conclusions. I wasn't in their place during the war. I didn't shoulder the weight of a worldwide organization. But I see why many people refer to the Vatican archives as a site of delayed facts. Not because those truths were forgotten, but because no one was willing to confront them until much later. People frequently think of the Vatican as a Western institution associated with Europe and the history of Christianity on that continent. However, what is revealed by the records that are hidden deep within the archives is different. The Vatican had a vision that extended eastward across boundaries from the very beginning. And I first realized the full scope of the Church's missionary goals when reading those yellowed pages. Its attempts at communication, and the deep and frequently tense interactions between Asia and Catholicism. Mission d'Orient Eastern Missions is the name of one section of the archives. Thousands of documents from the 16th through the 20th centuries are included in it. These books, which were written in Latin, Italian, French, Classical, Chinese, and Japanese, tell the story of how European missionaries traveled eastward for centuries, bringing with them not just the Bible but also the ideals of a whole different world. Sina Lirta Jesuiti was the file I started with. It is an assortment of letters written between 1580 and 1773 by Jesuit priests from China to the Vatican. The works of Matteo Ricci, the first Westerner to enter the Forbidden City, are particularly noteworthy among them. Reike praises the Confucian moral code in his writings and suggests that the Vatican modify Catholic teachings to fit Chinese culture instead of forcing them on them. Not everybody was in agreement. The documents document intense discussions about whether Chinese converts should be permitted to maintain their ancestral privileges, in addition to their Catholic beliefs, which raged within the Vatican for decades. The so-called Chinese liberties were eventually outlawed by an edict issued by Pope Clement I. By 1721, missionary activity in China was outlawed entirely. As a result of this decision, which seriously strained ties with the Qing dynasty, documents pertaining to the relationship between the Vatican and Japan are included in another file that is categorized as very confidential diplomacy. One of them is a 1610 letter from Tokugawa Ieyasu written in Chinese characters. Remarkably straightforward in both translation and preservation. The internal order is disturbed by your religion. It separates masters and subordinates, fathers and sons. I don't permit it. A protracted string of heartbreaking reports ensued. Catholics were executed in large numbers in Nagasaki, priests were burned alive, and churches were destroyed. But I read incredible tenacity from those pieces. Japanese believers who were imprisoned wrote handwritten letters in blood on scraps of fabric and delivered them to the Vatican via Portuguese merchant ships. Only people who believed in something bigger than themselves and paid the ultimate price for that belief were present. There was neither mysticism nor dramatization. Then I stepped into another world. The Vietnam-related documents. This current had a unique personality of its own. Trapped between mission and politics, between faith and sovereignty, and between East and West. A 1790 letter from Bishop Pigno Debahan to the Vatican detailing his attempts to assist Prince Guan, who would later become Emperor Zhelang, in rebuilding his army and regaining the throne was preserved in one file. It was more than just a missionary report in that letter. It was tangible proof that Catholicism, not just as a foreign religion but also as a force for nation building, influenced the development of contemporary Vietnamese statehood. However, the archives also document the darker periods, the Nguyen dynasty's anti-Christian decrees, the executions of Christians, and the frantic requests of missionaries. 1833 document describes the Le Van Khoi uprising, which was met with some Catholic community support and a cautious response from the Vatican. We must avoid letting faith and disobedience mix. There was a subtle conflict in that line between the need to keep the faithful safe and the worry about getting sucked into unmanageable local disputes. The connection between the Vatican and Vietnam became even more complicated in the 20th century. Reports on the mass migration to the south, Catholic life in the north, and the Saigon government's influence over episcopal appointments are all abundant in one file that spans the years 1954 to 1975. Pope Pius XI was sent President Noering DM a letter that had a subliminal message. In addition to blessings, a national leader has an obligation to uphold justice for all of his subjects in addition to defending their faith. It was one of the rare texts that was written with both encouragement and caution. A separate dossier detailing the unsuccessful attempts to re-establish diplomatic ties between the Vatican and the socialist country of Vietnam after 1975 may have been the item that most disturbed me. The Vatican's patience is evident in internal notes, its persistent requests for communication and its aspirations to restore a humanitarian avenue. However, each meeting concluded with a courteous formality. According To a 1989 document, we have to wait. A component of the mission is patience. I could sense the weight of history even in the silent pages. Every red seal and letter was more than just official documentation. It was a remnant of the protracted and challenging intercultural exchange. The Vatican did not always comprehend the East or act appropriately. However, the fact that the Vatican's core contains thousands of documents about Asia is evidence of something more profound. This was never a separate world. It has consistently been a vibrant, long-lasting aspect of world history. I used to think of the Vatican as a single, cohesive whole, a flawless organizational pyramid that had no space for internal division. But I didn't start to understand until I was deep in the archives. In addition, the Vatican is a dynamic organization that is rife with conflicts, inconsistencies, and occasionally quiet conflicts among its members. Under papal secrecy, 1 part of the archive is designated Sub Secreto Ponteo. Recorded conflicts between popes and cardinals or between popes and their successors are included. When the parties involved are still living, these documents are never released to the public. They are only preserved when those incidents have been documented, or the individuals involved have resigned from their positions. A particularly illuminating collection of documents details the conflict between Cardinal Joseph Siri, a former front-runner for the Pope, and Pope Paul VI. Siri fiercely opposed modernizing the Church during the Second Vatican Council, opposing everything from conversing with other religions to replacing Latin at Mass with vernacular languages. According to internal documents, he condemned what he perceived as the destruction of the sacred in a private letter to Paul. Only 2 lines long, the Pope's response was blatantly chilly. The shepherd cannot wait for the hesitation of the gatekeeper. Theological disagreements were not the only ones. The Vatican's financial management was likewise severely flawed. The Vatican bank crisis involving the Instituteur, or IO, in the late 1970s and early 1980s is among the most scandalous and well-documented occurrences in the archives. I still recall holding a thick, typewritten dossier called Caro Calvi that was almost 600 pages long. It alludes to the 1982 hanging of Italian banker Roberto Calvi beneath London's Blackfriars Bridge. Because of his strong connections to the Vatican Bank, the media referred to him as God's banker. Although his death was officially declared a suicide, the records kept in the Vatican archives provide evidence to the contrary. Records of dubious loans, correspondence between the IR and Banco Ambrosiano, bank statements, and lists of accounts owned by front groups in Panama were all contained within. A bishop's handwritten memo expressed serious worry. We are engaging in acts that are dangerously close to sin by exploiting holy resources. However, the caution was disregarded. The files also show internal attempts to rearrange documents so Italian authorities wouldn't be able to conduct a legal inquiry. Destructing was the label applied to at least 3 documents. They were never destroyed for some reason. The Vatileaks file is equally critical. The Tutti scandal involving leaked Vatican documents. Paolo Gabrielli, Pope Benedict XVI's personal butler, is still well known for copying and smuggling out a large number of private documents. The entire sequence of events, from the internal investigation to Gabriel's handwritten confession, is preserved in a special box in the archives. I did not betray the Holy Father, he wrote in it. All I wanted was for the Church to be aware of what was going on behind closed doors. Serious internal conflicts, factions, competing interest groups, and power struggles for influence were all exposed in the released documents. Numerous articles revealed attempts to stifle ethical and criminal issues, financial favoritism, and corruption in ecclesiastical appointments. Each line represented a breach in public confidence. An uncommon indication that the wall of silence had started to crumble was the Vatican's decision to bring Gabriel to trial in public. The question, why does the Vatican maintain papers that could harm its own reputation, was posed to a priest who oversaw the archives. After grinning, he answered with a line I will never forget. Because we are not the owners of the truth. It just goes through us. The archives of the Vatican don't want to obliterate history. They uphold it as an implicit act of responsibility, sometimes in grief and other times in silence. And that is what makes this location so profoundly human, a place where failure, faith, and strength are written in ink rather than water, more than any monument of a saint. Few individuals are aware of this. Not all meetings between the Pope and heads of state are made public. Only a few pictures of handshakes and a diplomatic statement about peace, cooperation, and understanding are released to the public. However, I discovered handwritten documents of what was actually discussed behind closed doors in the Vatican archives. Conversations that were meticulously recorded in ink made to last a century, occasionally marked by dispute, and occasionally frank and emotional. A record of the 1939 meeting between Pope Pius V and Diego von Bergen, Nazi Germany's ambassador to the Holy See, is among the most stunning files. Tensions with Poland were growing at the time of Hitler's invasion of Czechoslovakia. Does your government still control the hatred it has sown within German society? The Pope asked sharply in the internal note, without directly condemning the act. The ambassador didn't directly respond. The file ends with the remark, "The atmosphere turned markedly cold." No closing prayer was said. It's a minor thing, yet it says a lot. As I moved on to the 1960s, I discovered the transcript of a 1965 meeting between Soviet Foreign Minister Andrei Gomio and Pope Paulisk. The gathering was praised by the public as a historic attempt to restore communication between the East and the West. The Soviet delegation stated that religion is a tool for distorting historical truth, the scribe wrote in the archival transcript. Gently but firmly, Paul VI said, "No one can prevent another from having faith in the sacred. Power isn't that. It is a component of the human spirit." Without saying anything else, he then asked the whole delegation to stand silently for a minute in remembrance of all unidentified people who gave their lives for causes they believed in. No official document from the Soviet side ever made reference to this gesture. Simply labeled USA visit reserved United States. Unpublished visits is another noteworthy collection of files. Notes from private meetings between American presidents, including Roosevelt, Eisenhower, Kennedy, Reagan, and George W. Bush, and popes are included. One entry documents a scene from the 1963 encounter between Pope John XXIII and President John F. Kennedy. President Kennedy was gravely concerned about the possibility of nuclear war after the Cuban Missile Crisis. When the world has no moral foundation to stand on, who will remain calm first? The Holy Father questioned. Oddly, both men had little time after that encounter. A few months later, Pope John died, and at the end of the same year, Kennedy was assassinated. Although there is no obvious link in the file, some archive staff designated it as especially sensitive because of how close those events were. These documents document more than just the world's superpowers. I once discovered a faded old File on a meeting between General Secretary Gorbachev and Pope John Paul II. In 1989, shortly before the fall of the Berlin Wall. Although Gorbachev was not religious, he stated in the meeting minutes that nothing would remain to be preserved if nothing changed. In response, John Paul II said, "Truth emerges when people grow weary." The Vatican was among the first organizations to predict the disintegration of the Eastern Bloc following that discussion. Smaller countries, or those without established diplomatic relations with the Vatican, produced some of the most startling documents. I discovered an internal memo from 1991 in a file labeled Vietnam Colloquy Non-Official. In Geneva, representatives of the Vietnamese government met with an unofficial Vatican delegation. Although there was no official agreement, a willingness was stated. One of the first discrete actions taken to re-establish communication after 1975 was this. Not through news headlines, but through silently recorded handwritten words. The Vatican lacks both a robust economy and military might. However, after reading these documents, I realized this. A world leader comes to the Holy See when they are looking for sincerity or counsel free from political pressure. The Vatican is well aware of this. Every page it preserves has the potential to change the perception of an entire generation if it is made public at the appropriate time, so it rarely needs to speak loudly. This is one of the things that distinguishes the Vatican from all other places of worship worldwide. It's more than just a church. It is a sovereign state as well. It has the authority to issue diplomatic communications, sign treaties, and even face legal action. And I saw a whole other side of the Holy See in quasi-juridic, one of the least talked about parts of the Vatican archives. The language used in these pages is legal argumentation rather than prayer. Few anticipate that the holy side of the Vatican will ever be challenged in court. In actuality, however, the Vatican has been embroiled in hundreds of court battles with other governments and with its own people since the early 1900s. The famous legal dispute between the Vatican and the Italian government after the Lateran Treaty was signed in 1929 is described in one thick file. The ownership of hundreds of structures, churches, and monasteries throughout Italy was at stake. It was not just a question of privileges or borders. We cannot allow sacred territory to become negotiable property, but neither can we let it to be nationalized without conditions, one memorandum makes plain. The years-long negotiations occasionally threatened to degenerate into a diplomatic catastrophe. In order to establish the legitimate ownership of property from the medieval era, the Vatican frequently used original documents from these archives that were signed by popes as early as the 12th century and written in Latin. As a result, many Catholic properties are still legally inviolable today. Documents about sexual abuse in the Church that came to the attention of the world in the early 2000s, however, are arguably the most upsetting and agonizing. Filed as quasi-disciplinary Rivety confidential disciplinary cases, a sensitive category. I read documents that I had never been taught to expect in seminary. A 1962 internal probe in a North American daisy is described in one file. A minor was the casualty. The offender was a priest who had previously been the subject of several reports. However, the order from above was made explicit in the message. Move this person to a different parish. Keep the situation private. Keep the community from experiencing scandal. The next congregation was not warned. The same offense was committed again years later. This was not a singular instance. Similar files, some of which were never reported by the media, can Be found from Argentina, Germany, Ireland, and the Philippines. Victims' letters, sometimes in trembling script, made their way to the Vatican. I have no idea. Who else will pay attention? Don't act like nothing happened, please. Some didn't get a response. Others received the designation of internal review. Although the Vatican has never denied the existence of abuse, it has handled the problem as an institutional crisis rather than just a case of personal misconduct. Stricter disciplinary measures have been in place at the Holy See since 2001, and numerous documents show this slow change. However, the excruciating slowness of change was what kept me silent. What proportion of the Bible is divine truth, and the extent to which choices were influenced by past events? A confidential session of the Council of Nicaea. In 325, the first significant assembly of Christian bishops from all across the Roman Empire to codify doctrine is described in another document. Many of the texts included in the minutes are no longer in existence. Some writings are to be retained for deeper theological study, not for public reading, a Greek scribe writes in a side note. This implies that they were only withheld rather than destroyed, and they might still be in locked drawers like the ones in front of me. What is right or incorrect is not stated in the archive. All interpretations, variations, and fractures in the history of belief are preserved by its silence. That would be unnerving to some, but not to me. Faith is resilient because it can withstand disagreement, revision, and even skepticism, not because it is flawlessly consistent. As the heir to Saint Peter, the Pope represents stability, continuity, and the unflinching Catholic faith to the outer world. However, there is something few dare to contemplate hidden in the Vatican archives, beneath confidential documents, private files, and unpublished notes. The Pope is a human being. The weight of uncontrollable circumstances has caused them to question, worry, and occasionally collapse. I can still clearly recall my initial discovery of a folder named Letter Non-Inviates Never Sent. Several popes' handwritten drafts were included. Never responded, never printed. Neither formal decrees nor diplomatic communications were involved. They resembled entries from a journal, kept by men of the highest spiritual rank, who wrote down things they were unable to express out loud. Pope Benedict XIII's 1917 essay, written during the height of World War I, is among the most eerie. It was written to European leaders, begging for a halt to the fighting so that the sound of artillery would not destroy humanity. However, the letter was never delivered. No one will listen. The Cardinal Secretary of State at the time wrote in the margin, "And Your Holiness will seem feeble if they don't pay attention." Before I discovered it more than a century later, the letter had been folded, put away, and forgotten. Some popes' writings for their successors were included in another file titled Reserve per Conclave. Only the College of Cardinals was supposed to see these materials. During the papal election, they were never made public. Pope Pius II wrote one such 12-page memo in 1938, at a time when anti-Jewish legislation was growing, and the Nazis were gaining control. The Pope was gravely concerned in his memorandum that elements of the German Church had started to covertly support the fascist government. "History will not speak of our wisdom if we do not speak," he cautioned. "It will mention our collusion." No one ever read that document. Before he could publish a public encyclical denouncing anti-Semitism, Pius the Christ passed away. Silent and sealed, the memorandum stayed in the archive. I stood still for a long time while looking at one file. It contained documents pertaining To Pope John Paul I, who was only in office for 33 days before passing away unexpectedly. That incident has been the subject of numerous conspiracy theories. The cold reality of internal letters revealing that the Pope had been planning a comprehensive overhaul of the Vatican's financial management, including modifications to the Vatican Bank and an examination of secret accounts connected to Italian financial organizations, was all that was revealed in the archives. However, the Church cannot preach purity if it is not transparent itself, he said in a handwritten note. Even though that line was emphasized 3 times, he was never given the opportunity to take action. Furthermore, one cardinal wrote in a meeting log that was held soon after his passing, "We must continue the mission, but we must not touch the structural foundations." I've been thinking about that line ever since. Even well-known popes like Francis and John Paul have left behind heartfelt handwritten letters. During the height of the abuse scandal, John Paul II wrote one unpublished draft that demonstrates obvious internal turmoil. "I'm not sure whether I've done enough. I pray every night for God's forgiveness as well as the forgiveness of victims I've never met." Like the papal tiara he wore for more than 20 years, his penmanship was simple, yet the words carried weight. Known for his intimacy and reformist nature, Pope Francis has also written letters that have never been made public. The sin of an individual does not destroy the Church, but the covering up does, was written in a letter to a cardinal who had been found guilty of abuse. According to an attached memo, the Vatican is still engaged in a heated internal discussion about what constitutes forgiveness and openness in the contemporary era. The pages of the Vatican archives, yellowed and shaky and never seen by the public, speak louder than any press release could ever. That Peter's chair is also a lonely journey under the glare of authority. And even the leader of the Church suffers sleepless nights just like any other person in the world. People associate the Vatican with faith, churches, and rituals. However, few people consider financial agreements with foreign banks, intelligence reports, or telegrams. However, these ostensibly secular components make up a significant portion of the Vatican archive's deepest layers, where the unofficial connections between the Holy See and worldly powers are documented line by line. Conti Rivati. Intelligence was the title of one of the first folders that astounded me. It includes records of covert communications, especially with the CIA and MI6, between the Vatican and Western intelligence services during the Cold War. A CIA official in Rome met with a Vatican cardinal to discuss anti-communist developments in the Middle East in a memo dated June 17, 1953, a few weeks after the Iranian coup. It was a short report. Although the Holy See will not directly interfere, it is willing to support local churches in their efforts to oppose atheism and advance democratic values. The message was apparent even though no official agreement was reached. It wasn't just the Vatican watching the world. It possessed the moral authority to shape the current of ideologies, particularly through religion. A covert encounter between Vatican officials and a CIA agent just prior to Pope John Paul II's visit to his native Poland is documented in another 1979 report. The Polish Pope's potential to motivate the Solidarity movement was of special concern to the CIA. "We are conscious of our responsibility. But the gospel is not a strategic tool," the memo said, but the Vatican offered no promises. A tactful answer that leaves possibility for silent action without explicitly acknowledging or rejecting. Secret communications between the Vatican and Israel's spy service, Mossad, are documented in another collection of data titled Relation Reservat, Israel, as tensions between Jews and Palestinians Rise, the Vatican urges in the correspondence that Christian holy places in Jerusalem be protected. We do not care about the religion of the person standing in a sanctuary so long as they are not hiding weapons, read an MSAD report. Return to the Vatican. "TUR but telling," was the Vatican's response. "We don't conceal guns. We keep memories intact." The next layer I came across was related to finance rather than espionage. The Vatican's connections with various international financial institutions, such as Banco Ambrosiano UBS of Switzerland and financial organizations in Panama, were documented in a folder named Banker a Potter. Banking and Power. Wire transfer records and real estate investments in London, Paris, and even South American resort properties can be found in the KIT archives. According to an internal assessment from 1985, the Holy See's benevolent funds will receive a part of investment profits. Public disclosure is not necessary. The Vatican's use of shell corporations to evade scrutiny was the issue, not its investment activities. Although they were run by financial directors of private banks, some accounts were registered under the names of pastoral foundations. Although the organization was so opaque that it was practically difficult to trace funds, there were no indications of wrongdoing. And maybe that was exactly what was intended. Even more unexpected was a little, unstamped, unnumbered folder with the scribbled label Reportee Non-Official Fraternita Reserve. This document documented private meetings between top Vatican officials and members of Western secret societies, such as the Freemasons, a group that the Catholic Church has not condemned. According to a 1969 memo, a bishop in Switzerland met with a senior European Lodge Freemason to discuss potential topics of discussion regarding freedom of conscience and human rights. Although no decisions were made, it is noteworthy that Vatican policy started to change from a strict ban to a more cautious approach that discouraged involvement, allowing for interfaith discussion with groups that had previously been labeled heretical and establishing a gray area in doctrine. Although I did not discover any proof of a conspiracy or Vatican influence over global affairs, it is evident that the Vatican does not operate in a vacuum. It has a network that has been secretly operating for decades without being announced or made public. As if history takes place in the wings behind the curtain rather than on stage, its archives document every handshake, letter, and informal meeting. The light from the stained glass windows, the gilded splendor of the Sistine Chapel, the flickering candles, and the glittering sculptures in the vast basilicas are typically the first things that catch the eye of a visitor to the Vatican. However, few know that there is another world. One of quiet, condensation, and ceremony so complex it verges on the magical, that dwells alongside that light. Furthermore, it was the rituals themselves rather than the political documentation that disturbed me the most in the Vatican archives. These manuscripts, which have only been read aloud once and are kept behind drawers with 3 brass latches, have never left the stone walls. A handwritten manual called Ordo Rituum Conclavis, which was over 80 pages long and described the exact steps involved in setting up the papal conclave, was one of the most astounding documents I ever came across. No copies or public releases of the original are permitted. It is more than just a description, it is a living document that includes sealed ceremonies, whispered prayers, and even coded signals between authorities to make sure no information is lost. The ceremoniers promised to the secret master of ceremonies, who was tasked with maintaining complete quiet throughout the conclave, is documented in a particularly remarkable piece. Only the first line of the oath is visible. The rest of it is not written. In front of God and Saint Peter's shadow, I swear. remainder is written in a condensed Latin code that only the inner circle can understand. Should the pledge be breached, every prayer within the sanctuary will lose its virtue, says a remark in the margin. It was difficult to overlook the gravity of that sentence, whether it was real or metaphorical. Another document I found stated that it should only be used in the absence of a pope. Ordo exec Pontifex Maximi is the internal procedure that is followed once a pope passes away. It describes every aspect, including who gets to enter the papal chambers first, who closes the doors, and the public announcement routine. I was shivering over one passage in particular. The Camelot will call the Pope's name 3 times in Latin through the closed door before making the announcement to the world. He will pronounce the Holy Father dead if no answer is received. It's more than just a custom. It is the last representation of both power and death. I also found a brief manual that was saved for a special occasion. Extraordinary canonization. A saint's unusual canonization outside of the customary procedure. Just 8 pages. It has odd prescriptions in it. The relic needs to be an element that cannot be broken down. The duration of the ceremony must be exactly 3 hours. Neither more nor less. Additionally, the person announcing the title must too be related to the saint's community either by blood or by spirit. It's unclear if these regulations are still in effect, although the paper hasn't changed. The symbolist non-publicist on non-public symbols was one of the least well-known files. It lists the covered colors, objects, and symbols that the Vatican uses in emergency or extraordinary circumstances. A doctrinal crisis is being discussed. For instance, when a scarlet thread is diagonally strung across a Vatican chamber to indicate that the room is undergoing theological deliberation, or a bottle of dark brown ink called ink of silence is used exclusively to write private messages. Only the highest clergy can understand the explanations in archaic Latin that accompany each symbol. What most troubled me, though, was a thin, black, leather-bound book with simply a date and no title. April 3, 1945, Dram. CMXLV. There was a ritual inside that had never been performed in preparation for the possibility that the Soviet Red Army or fascist forces would take control of Rome. It described the process for sealing sacred relics, how to destroy confidential documents and explain the benedictionary ultima rite, which is the last blessing that should only be given in the event that Vatican sovereignty is totally lost. Since the writing of that blessing, no one has read it out loud. However, it waits in the shadows for a moment when the world's acclaim never comes. The Vatican is both a state and a ritual. Furthermore, ritual is more than just an activity in its archives. It is the memory language. Essential components of this structure include every written prayer, every crimson seal, and every phrase that has been spoken only once in centuries. In a world that is changing every day, some things need to be kept, if only to serve as a reminder that we once believed in something timeless. This is not superstition. I discovered an antique wooden box with the word index etched on it in a quiet hallway in the Vatican Archives' northern basement. It had a lengthy and complicated past, but it had neither a seal nor a guide. The Vatican fully preserved the conflict between faith and knowledge. Every book title, every justification for bans, and every private discussion that was never made public. At the height of the Counter-Reformation, in 1559, Pope Paul IV formally published the Index Laorum Prohibitorum, or list of books that were prohibited. For more than 4 centuries, it developed into the most potent censoring tool the Holy See had ever used. However, a list is not all that is kept in the archives. It is the procedure, the discussions, the contentious debates, and occasionally the profound inconsistencies amongst theologians, clergy, and even popes. I was holding a yellowed typewritten document from 1907 that contained the minutes of a meeting of the Congregio Pro Doctrina Fide, the office responsible for doctrine protection. Members discussed whether or not to include historian Errol's account of Jesus' life, the Vita Jesu, in the index. Some claimed that by depicting Jesus as merely a historical person rather than a divine being, Ren blasphemed. However, one bishop objected to the prohibition, arguing that it would acknowledge his influence. The argument, which shows how censorship within the church was not always unanimous, but frequently a conflict between the preservation of faith and the needs of the contemporary age, is intact even if the book was eventually banned. A single line, Galileo, Galileone, was used to label another file that was almost 300 pages long. It includes all of the documents related to Galileo's trial. Not only the sentence but also handwritten supplications for mercy, letters from subsequent generations, including Pope John Paul II's official 1992 admission of the Church's error, and notes from bishops who disagreed with his censure. According to 1633 document, we do not condemn science. We denounce the conceit that aims to transcend revelation. That statement is still relevant today, particularly in light of scientific theories that were originally thought to be harmful. The Vatican now acknowledges that evolution and the Big Bang are not incompatible with religion. In addition to books, the Church formerly had a special body dedicated to media and art, which I subsequently learned had a file called Cinema Ed. Reviews of movies that were shown in Catholic nations between the 1920s and the 1980s are included in this section. There were some odd entries. Fellini's Dulce Vita was criticized for being overly secular, but it captures the emptiness of a world devoid of God. Catholic schools have outlawed the conclusion, but it hasn't been publicly denounced because doing so would just make it more appealing. The Church's reaction to allegorical or philosophical literature is documented in another section. It covers George Orwell's 1984, which some have interpreted as a critique of religious totalitarianism. Internal records, however, came to the conclusion that this is a rejection of secular dictatorship. No answer is required. It reveals that Vatican censors were often subtle analysts, not reactionary, but selective in their battles. The file that described the Vatican's internal review of Dan Brown's Da Vinci Code and was marked internal circulation only, do not reproduce, was arguably the most interesting. Internal reports claimed that the book's impact stems from taking advantage of the public's lack of knowledge about religious symbols and rituals, despite the fact that many clergy publicly condemned it. Education, not condemnation, is the best course of action. Rather of banning the book, the Vatican replied with a series of counter-publications, a strategy change from suppression to engagement. Although the index was formally discontinued in 1966, the files are still silent, unaltered, and arranged like a reminder on Vatican shelves. The most effective way to influence how and when people are exposed to an idea is to shape it rather than to forbid it. Furthermore, the Vatican has done more than only protect the faith for centuries. It has determined when, to whom, and to what extent the boundaries of knowledge should be opened. When I stepped inside the part called Crusata, an unnerving silence fell over everything around me. The diplomatic telegrams, maps, and well-prepared Dossiers between envoys from the 20th century were all gone. All that was left were red wax seals, paper scrolls, and black ink that had previously been held between the fingers of Europe's most influential men. What was left over from a period when faith was turned into war was preserved here by the Vatican. Although the Crusades were conducted in the name of holiness, they left bloodstains on history that could not be removed by prayer. The original crusading bull of 1095 Deus Vult, which Pope Urban II published at the Council of Claremore, was among the first papers I came upon. It starts with an urgent plea and is written in Latin. They have taken the Holy Land. Jerusalem cries the blood of the faithful. The Catholic has to march. No political agenda exists. Just a call to arms, with no reference to land or wealth. Nevertheless, millions of people were killed under the shadow of the cross, and that call sparked more than 2 centuries of non-stop conflict. Later records, particularly those from Pope Innocent III's reign, demonstrate how the Crusades changed from being a purely spiritual appeal to a planned effort that included supply chains, taxation, recruiting, and rewards. I came upon correspondence between European lords and the Vatican that addressed the issue of knights provisioning and, more concerning, the authority to confiscate the property of individuals who refuse to convert or support the cause. The Vatican's internal response to the Fourth Crusade, which sacked Constantinople, the center of Eastern Orthodoxy, rather than Jerusalem, is documented in a particularly stunning document from 1204. A disturbing revelation can be found in the minutes written by Cardinal Pietro Capuano. Instead of following the Spirit, we followed the sword. Heresy was not defeated by us. Our brethren were plundered. No compensation or apology was ever offered, despite Pope Innocent III's formal but restrained denunciation of the looting. However, it was the post-war documents that most troubled me, not the ones from the war. The Vatican's reflections and acknowledgments of the past are preserved in a file called Requiem Prayer, a prayer for the error. It contained a draft of a speech by Pope Paul VI that had not yet been published and was intended to be given during his visit to Istanbul in 1960. We introduced violence into areas that formerly knelt in prayer, it says. We can't say that this was God's intention. A more neutral speech was given in its place after the speech was abruptly withdrawn. But under the dust, the original is still here. Less well-known crusades, such as the Northern Crusades against pagan people in the Baltics, the Albigensian Crusade in southern France to exterminate the Cathars, and even campaigns against Catholic monarchs who disobeyed were preserved in the Vatican archives. A bishop who refused to join a crusade is described in a 13th century record as saying, "I do not see God in fire and blood." Soon after, his office was taken away from him. However, subsequent attempts at communication and reconciliation are also documented in the archives. Correspondence between the Orthodox churches of Russia, Greece, and Armenia communities still affected by the Crusades and the Holy See is contained in a folder called Reconciliat. If blood once divided us, let prayer begin to bind the wounds that history left behind, Pope John Paul II wrote in a 1999 letter to Ecumenical Patriarch Bartholomew. Although it wasn't a formal apology, it was a start. I didn't see a cruel or malicious Vatican in any of these papers, but I did see an organization that used to use religion as an excuse for war and gradually came to understand its own nature over many centuries. While none of these texts downplay the past, they also do not minimize the present. Justification is not The goal of the Vatican archives. They uphold it with solemn devotion to memory, and the conviction that redemption requires the acceptance of truth, no matter how bitter. I was looking for documents about medieval church councils one rainy afternoon when an old archivist pointed to a small, lonely wooden box at the end of the shelf and said, "You should read this. Here, the church preserves what it has never announced but has never thrown away." Because even they were aware that some women had once contributed to the establishment of the very basis of faith. There was a handwritten note and a catalog number on the box, but no name. Myers in Ecclesiar, Silencio. Women in the Church's silence. It was not a vast collection of records, but it did include a subdued, enduring stream of history that the Vatican Hagel never formally recognized, not because it was disobedient, but rather because it brought up an issue that hasn't been settled. What role do women really play in a religion that has been dominated by men for almost 2,000 years? I started with a collection of handwritten letters written by German nun, composer, theologian, and visionary Hildegard von Bingen in the 12th century. She documented spiritual visions of great theological and philosophical depth in the majority of her writings in Latin and Old German. The soul of a woman is also breathed into being by God, Hildegard wrote in a letter to Pope Eugenius III. Why, then, must her speech only be heard through male mouths? Interestingly, there was silence in response to the letter rather than censure. A intentional and calculated silence. Hildegard was not labeled a heretic, however. Instead, she was praised by a number of voices in the Roman Curia, but they maintained her at a distance. I came across the statement, "This woman is not wrong, but the Church cannot yet authorize women to preach from the pulpit," in one internal document. Her intelligence was acknowledged, but she and innumerable others were never permitted to cross an invisible line. As I dug further, I discovered another file called Monolium Scripture, Nuns' Writings. It was a compilation of liturgical texts, poetry, and prayers written by women in religious orders between the 9th and 16th centuries. They included defiant and elegant prayers. "I'm not requesting to be a priest," I asked. "To tend a candle unseen, blazing softly in the darkest church corner. Instead of being spoken in formal writing, these remarks were handwritten and transferred from one person to another, their brown, black ink still visible on parchment that had softened with time. However, the dossier on heresy investigations, especially those that targeted women whose spiritual influence became too great, was the most unsettling element. A group of ladies who had just presented their personal interpretations and held Bible readings were tried for illegal preaching in a case from southern France in 1321. "Do you believe women can understand the Word of God?" asks one interrogation tape. "If God picked a virgin to birth him, why would he not choose her tongue to announce him?" the woman Clara said. She was burned at the stake, but not all voices were hushed, the record concludes. In the files from the Second Vatican Council, I found letters and internal minutes detailing serious deliberations on expanding women's responsibilities in the modern church. It is not enough to attract more women into the church, Cardinal Sunins wrote in a handwritten letter. We have to acknowledge that they have always existed. Vatican commissions started appointing women as theological advisors in 1965. However, as one document made clear, consultano non diter means that they may offer advice but do not make decisions. The notion of female deacons was discussed in a 2016 meeting, whose minutes I recently discovered. A group of female theologians provided historical proof that early Christian Greek texts from the 1st to the 3rd centuries acknowledged deaconesses. One cardinal retreated. Today's ordination was not the same as that. If a truth must be suppressed because our current framework cannot contain it, then the fault is not with the truth, said another, whose name was censored in the version I saw. I sat silently for a long time after hearing that sentence. These women have never been highlighted by the Vatican archives, but they were not erased either. Strong enough to endure the winds of time, but not loud enough to reverberate from pulpits, they continue to exist in the margins of history like slanted footnotes. As I shut that wooden box, I realized that the church was made of more than just men and stone. It was created by women who raised believers, cleaned vestments, copied holy books, and silently tended to the faith's flame during its darkest centuries. The Vatican is frequently regarded as a symbol of forgiveness and faith, as well as a moral sanctuary. However, the reality is that errors occur everywhere there are people. And inside St. Peter's Square's historic stone walls, it is not always external factors that cause those errors. They can occasionally originate internally. I started looking at a number of case files that had been kept secret for many years in a division of the Vatican archives known as Dia Reservata, reserved crimes. They were not mystical in any way. No profanity. No sinister plots, just documents, signatures, and eerily thorough transcripts. Records of offenses carried out by the same organization that promotes virtue and grace. A 1969 theft from the repository of sacred relics was one of the first files I came across. The room that housed hundreds of sacred relics, such as early Christian handwritten scriptures, martyrs' robes, and saintly bones. The story claims that a young monk tasked with cleaning the vault stole a tiny box thought to have St. Lawrence relics. He made no attempt to sell it. He claimed to be able to hear the saint whisper, so he kept it in his room instead. The Vatican convened a private trial in dreams. No announcements, no journalists. The monk was laicized and permanently removed from Vatican territory, but there was no criminal prosecution as a result of the verdict. This action was motivated by misguided faith rather than avarice, according to a note that was included. Maybe that's why mercy won out. A much more serious case happened in 1982 when a teenage boy with Vatican citizenship was murdered inside the Vatican Gardens, just a few meters from the Pope's office. The victim was the son of a Vatican Treasury official, according to the case file with the number Castle AG 82. There was indications of blunt trauma to his head when his body was discovered close to the southern wall. A gatekeeper with a history of mental illness is the main suspect. Every stage of the interrogation and examination was included in the more than 400-page internal probe. The suspect was said to have lost control as a result of psychological seclusion and religious fear. However, the Vatican handled it internally rather than turning it over to the Italian authorities. He was never put on trial in public and was kept in a remote monastic building isolated from the outer world. The serenity of the devout must be safeguarded more than the curiosity of the crowd, the report's last sentence states. The Codex Juris Canonici, or canon law, serves as the foundation for the legal system that the Vatican uses. However, it has also incorporated several aspects of Italian law, particularly in serious criminal matters, since the 1929 Lateran Treaty. However, jurisdiction is still retained by Vatican courts, whose judges are usually cardinals or high-ranking clergy. I found a List of judges from 1929 to the present in the archives. Names that are not listed in public records but have a great deal of power in situations that could threaten the moral foundation of the Church. The Vatican Bank's suspected involvement in money laundering in 2009 to 2011 was the subject of another noteworthy file. Despite being mentioned by the media, the documents I viewed included transcripts of private meetings between financial advisors and bishops as well as internal accounting records. There was incompetence in monitoring transfers from the Opus account to a bank in Liechtenstein, according to a 2010 audit, although no official charges were ever brought. However, the director of the bank resigned shortly after, leaving only a single note in the minutes of his last meeting, and no press conference or press release. Instead of exposing the wound to public carving, we decide to carry it. The story of Emanuela Orlandi, a 15-year-old girl and Vatican citizen who vanished in 1983, is still one of the most eerie and possibly the most mysterious. For decades, her story has been the subject of innumerable speculations about Vatican cover UPS, political intrigue, and the Italian mafia. The associated file, Reservatissimo, Top Secret, is located inside the archives. A few pages from 1985, including a memo alleging that the Vatican had received an anonymous letter suggesting Emanuela was alive and being held for political negotiations, were all that I was allowed to view. No formal answer was given. Replying invites turmoil if the assertion is untrue. One cardinal wrote, "Silence is our only option if it's true." Thus, the Vatican decided to remain silent for 40 years. Although the archives are not a courtroom, they are where the unwritten rulings are stored, not always for concealment, but because every transgression becomes systemic in a space as limited and symbolic as the Vatican. Every flaw represents a breach in the moral foundation that millions of people share, not just a particular folly. Therefore, the Vatican decides to deal with these issues in secret, using the law but not the light. Art is the precious key that opens the most profound depths of the human spirit. If the Vatican is a treasure trove of faith, the marble sculptures, the stained glass windows that use images to tell the stories of the scriptures, and the fresco on the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel have all become part of human history. Few people are aware of this, though. Some paintings, drawings, studies, and even finished pieces of art have never been viewed by the general audience. Hidden away in the Vatican's vaults, they continue to exist in silence. I was shown into a silent basement hidden underneath the Vatican Museum's one foggy morning. No guided tour ever included this area. I discovered Deposito Toico Rivato, the reserved painting repository, a little vault located beyond 3 iron doors. Artworks that have not yet been assessed, have never been seen, or have been excluded because they are incongruous with the present theological direction are kept here. I will never forget what I witnessed inside, even if no one says this out loud. An unpublished sketch by Michelangelo, a charcoal figure stretching out in agony and longing on darkened paper, was on the first rack I came to. It was like Adam's creation in the Sistine Chapel. But the figure was encircled by darkness rather than God's light. Non-designated for the chapel, was scrawled in a handwritten note underneath the drawing. Too human. What? I pondered, made a drawing by Michelangelo unfit to hang on the walls of the Vatican. It might have articulated something theology is afraid to confront. Not only is mankind a creature in need of redemption, but it is also a hopeless one that does not always seek the light. 2 oil paintings bearing Raphael Sanzio's signature were on another shelf, but the ink had faded to gray. According to an accompanying study, these pieces' style was too worldly for the rest of his known body. One showed a pregnant woman clutching a cross, a powerful picture that was considered theologically contradictory because the Virgin Mary is never shown in this manner. A masterpiece was veiled not because it was unattractive, but rather because it raised questions. This is because a minor annotation beneath the red confusion dominale may lead to doctrinal confusion. Additionally, I discovered a painting that was credited to Caravaggio but was never displayed. It depicted Saint Peter as a lowly fisherman who was not yet an apostle. He was holding a ripped fishing net with dirt on his face. A weary guy at the start of faith, no holy sign, no halo, no divine illumination. Was it suppressed for that reason? Because it felt too real, or because it did not have the sanctified image of a purified saint? Another folder with the name Iconographia. Artworks that had been asked to be taken down, covered, or never reproduced were listed. In Contata Controversial Iconography. These included sculptures of the Virgin Mary with Asian and African characteristics made by regional craftspeople during missionary times. Diversity is part of divine creation, but uniformity is necessary to preserve sanctity, according to a 1911 Vatican Cultural Council memo. According to that reasoning, a large number of these statues were never positioned on altars. Even Vatican decisions to turn down exhibitions or partnerships with well-known artists like Salvador Dalí, Francis Bacon, or Ai Weiwei were documented in a special section devoted to modern art. Dalí has suggested a number of fantastical revelations of the saints, according to an internal memo from 1950. We cannot allow sacred iconography to become obscure visual metaphor, Vatican officials retorted. However, these works are not destroyed by the Vatican. On the contrary, they take great care to maintain them, recording every fracture, brush stroke, and pigment layer, but they still decide to keep them secret. In the blazing clarity of theology, something too personal, too raw, or too incomplete might upset a faith that depends on certainty, not because the work is unworthy. I didn't have any crucifixes or pictures of angels with me as I left that crypt. All I could recall were the dust-covered eyes, the eyes of paintings I had never laid eyes on. And I pondered whether the Vatican hides things from the world because they don't want people to stop believing. However, the terror of confronting a work in progress, wherein heaven and earth, as well as saints and sinners, are still up for argument and remain incomplete on the canvas. People do not think of telescopes when they think of the Vatican. Instead, they think of chapels, prayers, and theology. However, there is a peaceful root that is frequently disregarded that connects religion with the universe. One of the world's oldest astronomy research institutes is located in the Vatican. Additionally, its archives contain not only star charts but also a lengthy, personal history of tension and balance between belief and intelligence, between heaven and earth. Specular Vaticanana, the official name of the Vatican Observatory, was written on a small filing cabinet where my adventure started. Notes on comet sightings, solar eclipses, and unusual stars that appeared in the night sky were among the handwritten documents from the 17th to the 20th centuries that were found within. According to a 1610 journal that was taken from the original documents of Christopher Clavius, the Jesuit astronomer who contributed to the creation of the current Gregorian calendar, the stars are not chaos. They are indications of a system that we do not yet comprehend. I noticed something really illuminating in that line. Science was never really abandoned by the Vatican. It merely decided on its own terms of participation. Another cabinet included materials about the Galileo crisis that were the result of internal scientific discussion rather than condemnation. I discovered a 36-page paper from 1616 that was authored by a group of clergymen with backgrounds in astronomy and mathematics who wanted to make the case that a fixed Earth was both natural and consistent with the Bible. A young priest, however, posed the silent inquiry, should we not query why Scripture is silent on centrifugal force, in a marginal note? The Vatican maintained that not all doubts are heretical, even though the topic was never brought up in court. Then, in 1741, I discovered a handwritten manuscript by Pope Benedict XIV that was never made public and called for the restoration of Galileo's name. Perhaps because some acts of redemption only require a reader in silence rather than proclamations, the Vatican kept it even though it was never formally published. International scientific collaboration was added to the Vatican's files by the 20th century. The Vatican sponsored a trip to Africa to witness a total solar eclipse, according to a folder from 1935. We can measure darkness without faith, the expedition leader wrote in a letter to Rome. We dare to measure the disappearance of light because we think that there is divine order. Another 1981 document detailed a private discussion involving quantum physicists and theologians held in the Vatican. The multiverse idea was put forth by a professor from Switzerland. It was not a rejection. If God is infinite, the universe need not be unique, the minutes stated. Although it was an uncommon declaration, it showed that the Vatican had subtly changed. No longer a defender of unchangeable truths, but a home engaged in conversation with the ever-expanding boundaries of knowledge. I even discovered letters between NASA and the Vatican, especially around the period when humanity was getting ready to go on the moon. We pray for those who dare to leave atom skies to observe the Creator's work from without, said a 1962 handwritten letter from the Holy See to President Kennedy. The Vatican did not publicly celebrate Apollo 11's success. However, one line was noted in the private journal of Pope Paul V. Man does not only look up at the sky these days, they've been touched by him. To my surprise, I also discovered a copy of a 1990 letter that Stephen Hawking wrote to the Philosophical Academy of Sciences. In it, he questioned if the cosmological origins required God at all. No rebuttal came from the Vatican. If God must hide in the gaps of mathematics, then he is not genuinely everlasting. That theologian's private remark, which was never made public, spoke louder to me than 1,000 sermons. Sincere faith is unafraid of challenge. From Castel Gandolfo, the Vatican Observatory continues to run in silence today. They don't declare anything out loud. They avoid arguing with contemporary science. However, I discovered something even more significant in their archives. A faith that never puts an end to reason, but always pushes it to its limits so that something incalculable might still be there when the last starlight goes out. One late afternoon, sunlight streamed into the Vatican archives' lowest floors from the dome of St. Peter's Basilica. A drawer labeled Residential Diplomatic Ex Orient held diplomatic documents from both the East and the North, which I opened. It contained a number of letters, communications, and transcripts of contacts between the Vatican and large empires that did not practice Christianity, where beliefs did not coincide but power still required communication. It did not contain European-style treaties or agreements with Catholic kingdoms. I started with a 16th century dossier that described the early interactions between the Ottoman Empire and the Vatican. In 1584, Sultan Murad III wrote a letter to Pope Gregory II in Ottoman Turkish, which was translated into Latin. In it, the Sultan addressed the Pope as the head of the triune gods' followers and suggested a business agreement to guarantee respect for holy lands on both sides. The proposition was not rejected in the Vatican's response. The sword of faith is unnecessary when peace makes it possible to pray. A peculiar tone, wary but longing for a common order between two societies that have been depicted as incompatible for a long time. I discovered the transcript of a covered meeting between a Vatican diplomat and Qing dynasty representatives that took place in Macau in 1713 in another folder. It documented the Holy See's apprehension regarding Emperor Kangxi's proscription of Christianity in the wake of the rights dispute. We may retract the decree if it does not undermine sacred doctrine. The internal note stated, the court rejects the denial of Chinese writers, but it does not deny faith. The dialogue itself showed that the Vatican had realized that introducing faith into a different culture required humility rather than dogma, even though no agreement was reached. The negotiating cum Moscowia file, which was never declassified, caught my attention the most. It included documents indicating covert attempts to build ties between the Russian Tsars and the Vatican from the 17th to the 19th centuries. The Russian Orthodox Church had turned into the arm of imperial power, the Vatican wrote in an 1860 telegram, and without communication, church-to-church reconciliation would not be possible. When the throne wants perpetuity, it must listen to the voice of the eternal throne, Pope Pius X wrote in a private letter to Tsar Alexander II. The Vatican continued to write even though there was no response. The Vatican documented communication with a Japanese scholar on behalf of the Meiji court in 1902. The two sides talked about culture, theology, and whether Christian altruism and Shinto honor could coexist. In the transcript, one line caught my attention. Faith is not rejected in the East. Imposition is rejected. It seems to serve as a reminder to the Church. One cannot force truth upon another. It is not a gift. The Vatican suggested sending a covert ambassador to northern Vietnam to monitor the situation of Catholics after the Geneva Accords. According to an internal memo I discovered in 1954, shortly after the First Indochina War ended, no public document or official order existed. However, the envoy's handwritten note in the file stated, I observed priests silently celebrating Mass, their robes concealed beneath civilian clothing. Faith has never perished here, yet it doesn't make a sound. The report was never released. A collection called Prophecies, The Way of Peace, which included all of the correspondence between the Vatican and the UN from the conclusion of World War II to the present, was one of the most poignant files. The Church has no army, no vote, but it may nevertheless speak into the conscience of the world, a Cardinal wrote in a 1965 note marking the Vatican's admission as a permanent observer. That phrase is still accurate. However, the globe can't hear those voices as well as it used to. These records don't claim to have any influence. Instead, they portray a Vatican that is frequently in the weaker position, the one making contact, looking for points of agreement, and trying to comprehend its opponent. The Vatican was never a superpower, but it had another weapon under the shadow of geopolitical might: time. The Vatican is skilled at waiting. When it waits long enough, revolutions burn out, dynasties fall, and the Holy See keeps writing letters, even saving the unanswered ones. People frequently imagine shining light, sobbing statues, or heavenly hymns resonating from the heavens when they hear the word miracle. However, I did not see any light, smell incense, or hear any religious sounds when I initially entered the part titled Supernaturalist Recentio, Review of Supernatural Phenomena. Documents, audio recordings, medical transcripts, black and white photos, thousands of pages of reports, and lengthy columns of clinical analysis were all carefully filed. Much like a chamber used for crime scene investigation. The first file I opened was about the well-known Fatima incident, which is still regarded as a miracle. The Virgin Mary's 1917 apparitions in Portugal. However, the procedure of verification rather than the content of the visions was what the Vatican preserved the most. The Archbishop of Leiria sent a memo to the Holy See on October 26, 1930, stating, "We spoke with over 60 witnesses and took pictures of the sun during the predicted times, but we found no optical distortion in the cameras. The locals' descriptions of the movement of light, however, were strikingly consistent. The Vatican did not declare a miracle, but it also did not deny it. The event is appropriate for devotion, but not for belief, according to theological and pastoral standards. The archival records of apparitions consistently reach the same result. Always maintain a cautious distance, but never deny." In 1858, Bernard de Suberus, a young man, claimed to have seen the Virgin Mary several times in a grotto at Lourdes, France. Comprehensive transcripts of all interrogations, from senior clergy to local physicians, were preserved in the Vatican's file. "The girl displays no indicators of hallucination," was one of the document's lines. However, the persona she portrays does not align with the doctrinal ideas of the Virgin. During that era, the Vatican never hurried, and in the end, the Church relied on the unexplained healings from disease that followed pilgrimages to Lourdes, rather than directly validating the visions. I read in another file about the apparitions at Akita, Japan in 1973, which took more than 20 years of inquiry before the Holy See finally acknowledged them. Internal reports accompanied each move, and doctors, psychiatrists, and theologians were sent out. The sobbing figure of the Virgin is chemically verifiable but scientifically unexplainable, was one particularly striking note. It is not a miracle because of this. It is therefore deserving of observation. Then I came on to Cozy Ray rejected cases, an eye-catching registry. It had hundreds of reports that were judged to be false, overblown, or devoid of supernatural value. Photographs showed statues leaking water from plumbing leaks, audio recordings showed evidence of human tampering, and witnesses eventually withdrew their statements. The purported visionary in one Latin American case admitted to receiving payment from a pilgrimage group. According to the Vatican investigation, secular motive, file closed. There were cases of mysterious healings in another section of the collection. Every alleged miraculous recovery is assessed by the Consiglio Medica, an independent medical panel maintained by the Vatican. According to one 2002 file, a patient with Parkinson's disease made a full recovery after praying to Blessed John Paul II. It was confirmed by the attending physician. However, the Vatican pointed out that in order to rule out natural remission, 5 more years of observation are needed. Nothing romantic or hurried. Just a procedure as exacting as any clinical research. Aurora Messina, a 17-year-old Italian girl who claimed to receive nightly divine prophecies during full moons in 1966, was listed in one short file I came across. Although crowds flocked to her house, according to internal Vatican documents, no impartial proof was discovered after 7 months of observation. Her brother, who later admitted He only intended to preserve the villagers' faith, installed a concealed speaker beneath her bed, which was ultimately found to be the source of the divine voice. In her room, a red stamp was applied to the case, signifying deceit for fame. However, Lux in turquoise light among the blind, a file without a date, was arguably the most eerie. It included a statement from an old priest who lived in a Swiss mountain monastery. One night, he said, he saw a bright youngster in the snow. But it disappeared as he got close. He didn't request praise. He merely requested that the Holy See record his story so that others would not consider him insane. If they ever saw it, it was not confirmed nor denied by the Vatican. Silence is the only way to maintain the sacred, was one of the examiner's notes. The Vatican doesn't seek miracles. It watches. It has doubts. Every tear from a statue, every mysterious light, and every silent prayer in the fields are all measured by it. And in that quiet, it decides to hold on to what it does not yet know, not to show, but to remind itself that if God really does reveal himself, he will not require headlines or trumpet blasts. Only those who are patient enough to wait, as the Vatican has done for centuries, will hear of his arrival, which will come at unexpected times. I never intended to look for Saint Malik's prophecy. Many people in the Vatican are more uneasy than reverent when they hear that name. However, I once came into a small file hidden inside an unrelated dossier while looking through records pertaining to councils from the early 17th century. It was simply labeled De Prophetia Malachi, unpublished version. On the cover, a handwritten copy from 1595, the year Father Arnold de One first printed the prophecy in Rome in his book Lignum Vitae, was found inside. The Vatican kept this manuscript on file to track its dissemination, not because they believed in it. The people are enamored with this prophecy as if it were a fifth gospel, Cardinal Baronius wrote in a margin note. However, fear-based faith is not faith. During a visit to Rome in 1139, the Irish Archbishop Malachi O'Morger is credited with writing the prophecy of Saint Malik. He included 112 Latin mottos in it, each of which was supposed to represent a pope from Celestine to the very end, who is supposed to have seen the fall of the Holy City and the Day of Judgment. I discovered an unpublished internal table in the Vatican archives that mapped each prophecy to a real pope. Some of them were frighteningly true. In Kylo, the term lumen, light in the sky, was associated with Pope Leo II, whose coat of arms featured a bright star. The pious angelic shepherd, Pastor Angelicus, was admired for his spiritual life. However, the linkages become weaker as one moves down the list. This is the impact of reading backward. A 1978 Vatican letter finally determined people give value to past events rather than future ones. The last sentence, in persecution streti, however, was what kept the Vatican from categorically condemning the prophecy. Romanus Petrus, the horrible judge, will judge his people. The city of 7 hills will be demolished, and Peter the Roman will sit on the throne in the final persecution of the Holy Roman Church. Then, in 2013, the first papal abdication in 6 centuries occurred when Pope Benedict XVI resigned. His successor, Jorge Mario Bergoglio, was of Italian ancestry and was born in Buenos Aires. He adopted the name Francis. Blood from Rome. The Vatican unexpectedly received hundreds of messages from the faithful worldwide, all requesting the same thing, even though no pope has adopted the name Peter II. Is this pope the last one? The cardinals met in 2014, a few months after Francis was elected, according to an internal document I discovered. A young bishop voiced concerns during it that this prophecy is being used as a weapon to obstruct reform and stoke apocalyptic fear. The church does not fear the end, was the college's dean's straightforward response. Our sole concern is that people will cease to live for the future. Legendum non publicandum, to be read not published. Another file detailed a Vatican commission that had previously looked into the prophecy's actual origins. A number of academics contended that the entire text was composed in the latter part of the 16th century in order to endorse particular candidates during a papal conclave. If Malek really authored this, why is it never acknowledged for 400 years, one historian queried simply. However, the Vatican ultimately failed to come to a formal decision. We do not publish. What may confuse even in order to deny it, is the final line of the file. As a result, the prophecy is still a ghost that has neither been verified nor disproved. Like secret stairs, secret chapels beneath the basilica, or murmurs of angels. During papal elections, it has become a part of the mythology surrounding the Vatican. Is it authentic? Is it important? One old bishop once said to me as he turned the last page of that prophecy, perhaps those questions don't need solutions anymore. God never said some things, but he left them for people to choose whether or not to believe. For over 70 years, the Archiviopoi Anadigera archive was kept under seal. Only in 2020 were some of its components declassified. However, those that were revealed were just the tip of the iceberg. The fresh air of the Vatican corridors seemed to disappear as soon as I entered that room, to be replaced by an unseen burden. Pages devoid of bloodstains but weighed down by millions of silent deaths. I opened letter non respost, 1942, a folder. Letters that have not been replied. Numerous appeals from Jewish communities throughout Europe during the most heinous years of the Holocaust were included. One letter was from a rabbi in Slovakia and was dated August 1942. We do not request a public intervention, it said. All we ask is your confirmation that God is not quiet. The file included merely a pencil notation on the margin and no response. Response awaited, forwarded to the Secretariat of State. Vatican. Communications with Nazi authorities were documented in another folder. The German ambassador to the Vatican, Diego von Buren, promised in a November 1939 memorandum that the Reich will preserve religious freedom if the Holy See maintains neutrality on domestic problems. We do not intervene in politics, but we will respond if innocent life is threatened, was the response from Cardinal Maglian, who was Secretary of State at the time. Even if that voice did speak, the public never heard it. I was deeply shaken by one internal report. A letter from October 1943, sent directly to Pope Pius IX, a few weeks after fascist authorities had expelled Jews from Rome. It claimed that on October 16, almost 1,000 Jews were removed from the city. With no confirmed destination, the train left Tibetina Station. A Jesuit priest from a nearby parish signed the report. No directive was included. However, someone wrote in thin, quivering handwriting on the next page that prayer is the last resort. During the time when Jews were being killed at Mass, I did not find any handwritten directives from religious leaders to maintain a commanding silence, but I did find a lack of public statements, speeches, and messages. Drafts of 3 speeches that were never given were found in a folder named Discorsi Manenti Missing Talks. Secutella in No Like Stars in the Night was the title of one of them, which was dated December 24, 1942. We mourn the millions of innocent people who were killed because of their ethnicity, religion, or language in that line. However, no one ever read that message out loud. Would harm German parishes must wait, was written next to it. The waiting, however, never stopped. Behind closed doors, however, the Vatican did not keep completely mute. Throughout Italy, France, and Poland, I reviewed hundreds of documents detailing covert attempts to preserve Jews, particularly through churches, monasteries, and other places of worship. According to the 1944 dossier, more than 200 Jews were concealed at the Santa Brigida monastery while posing as pilgrims. If found, the abbot takes personal responsibility. Dozens more of these cases existed. However, since a single word could have led hundreds of people out into the light and to their deaths, the Holy See made no public declaration to validate or defend these activities. They will kill more if we talk, stated a 1944 letter from Bishop Angelo Rota in Budapest. Our conscience will perish if we keep quiet. No recorded response was found. However, I discovered an unsigned, handwritten line in a confidential memo. No one is holy enough to make the proper decision when faced with the choice between voice and life. Transcripts of internal meetings held after the war to prepare for the incoming barrage of criticism were found in a file called Defenses Silent Defenses and Silences. A public declaration that the Holy See had subtly saved lives during the Nazi regime was proposed by one cardinal. The plan was turned down. The Vatican decided to keep quiet and let the public discuss it instead. We do not speak, said. One last note. The words will be found by history, which has never given up. Pope Pius V, according to some, lacked bravery. According to others, he did everything he could within the constraints of his time and office. However, the information I found in the archives was not a verdict. It was the shattered chronicle of a time when moral clarity was stretched to its breaking point. Only the lingering reality of a frigid world remained, devoid of any heroic declarations or apologies. Whether silence is the result of strategy or fear, it leaves an enduring impression. I started to wonder, why does the Vatican store all of this, after spending hundreds of hours reading, turning page after faded page, down underground, where no bells sound and no lamps flicker? To control, to hide, to avoid confronting the truth, as skeptics could say. But why wasn't it destroyed long ago if that were all? Why meticulously record every internal memo, ignored request for assistance, and unspoken speech draft? Over time, I realized that the Vatican did more than just uphold the truth. It maintains the intricacy of reality. There are no excuses or outright lies in those archives. Silences, gaps, and partially recounted tales are all present. However, there are other voices that have been suppressed throughout history. Small, silent deeds that saved hundreds of lives without requesting recognition were never permitted to reverberate. No one is more aware than the Vatican that a truth stated at the wrong moment can be used as a weapon. As a result, they decide to wait rather than manipulate. They take their time opening each door. According to them, every generation should only be aware of what it is ready to comprehend. And even if it can be challenging, that is a kind of accountability. The room at the far end of the Western Hall, a tiny space behind an ancient wooden door bearing the Latin phrase Veritas Temporis Est, is still in my memory. Time inside is where truth belongs. The old archivist whispered to me that there were no files, only a blank book and a wooden desk. At this point, No further inquiries are made. All that's left is listening. I sat there reading every chapter I had come across in silence rather than writing. It flows like an unseen current across millennia, from secret meetings with emperors to hidden works of art, miraculous investigations, Vatican silence during World War II, the role of women, science, and ceremonies never performed. Though I left with a surety, I did not depart with solutions. Truth is shielded from oversimplification. In the Vatican archives, not buried there. Truth isn't always consoling. Angels in paintings that bear the face of terror, doubting popes, and faltering saints are occasionally revealed. That type of truth, however, is what makes faith genuinely mature, if it endures. And maybe that's why the archive keeps opening, not in accordance with history, but with humanity's conscience. The Vatican's doors will open when we have the courage to see the pure face of faith, not with a key, but with the silent willingness to comprehend and forgive. I left the Vatican feeling more like I was waiting for someone to come back than like I had left a stronghold of secrets. To listen to oneself, to history, and to memory, not to worship. Please click subscribe to support this channel if what you just heard feels